Okay, so good morning, everyone. So I think they should be a morning in your local time, although I'm joining in the afternoon from Manila, Philippines. So as was introduced by the chair, this session, my presentation will be focused on the global and the regional value chain landscape in Asia. And structure of this presentation will be as follows. Firstly, we'll go over some recent trend and trade growth for Asia, because when it comes to the GBC and RBC landscape, the basis should be the trade, because there could be either GDP or output-based approach or the trade-based approach in looking at the GBC angle. Then we usually use the trade angle, so that's why we need to have a look at the trade, the overall trend in trade first. Then I will move on to discussing the progress in GBC and RBC in the region. And then some topical issues, I will first talk about the impact of potential reshoring of the global supply chains. And then I will also touch upon one of the hottest issues at the moment with regards to the challenges in the semiconductor supply chains. Okay, the recent trend in trade growth. Actually, Asia's merchandise trade recovered quite fast in 2020. During the first half of the 2020, because of pandemic, the Asia's trade slumped quite significantly, but it recovered quite rapidly, even starting from the second half of last year. And coming into this year, the pace of the acceleration has even grown further. And then more recently, the trade growth is settling around at 10% year on year. This is quite reasonable because of some base effect. Although during the first half this year, compared to the first half last year, when almost all the regional economies have been hit hard by the pandemic due to the low base effect. The growth rate of the first half of this year should be much higher. But coming into the second half of this year, because the Asia trade growth already started to pick up during the second half of this year, the elevated level of the base effect will bring down the year-on-year the growth rate of trade for the region in the second half of this year. When it comes to the trade value growth, as you can see from the red line, its upswing and downswing is more pronounced than the trade volume growth, because there is also a price factor apart from the volume factor there. And then I'd like to bring your attention to the PRC, China's trade value growth, which is represented by the yellow line. Actually, China's trade growth was hit quite hard earlier part of last year in the February, something like that. Then it started to pick up even much earlier than the other Asian countries. So in that sense, China's trade recovery has led the entire region's trade growth, because China had been much more successful in containing the virus spread during the early part of last year. When we compare the different countries or sub-regions within Asia in terms of the pace of the trade growth, here we are comparing the newly industrialized economies such as the Korea, Singapore, Taipei, China, and Hong Kong, China. And on the right-hand side, we are showing the China and some selected ASEAN countries. As you can see from the chart, for both the export and import front, the ASEAN countries have experienced more significant the slump in terms of the trade growth last year, and also equally more pronounced uptick coming into second half of last year and first half of this year. So in that sense, the ASEAN countries have experienced more volatility or the more significant fluctuations in terms of trade growth, both the upward and downward direction. And when it comes to the overall, the export and the import trend, as you can see from the above panel and the below panels, overall the pace of the export for the region has been more quicker compared to the import, and then the import growth has been more prolonged and delayed, partly reflecting the delayed recovery of the domestic demand, such as the consumption investment across the region. So actually, Asia's interregional trade ties grew quite strongly over the past decades. As you can see from this orange line, Asia's interregional trade share has grown steadily over time, although the absolute level is still below than the EU's, but it is higher than the North America's. But one interesting point that I would like to bring your attention to is that even in the 2020, we can see the uptick in terms of the interregional trade share for Asia in the orange line. But when we take out the PRC from the picture, as you can see from the dotted orange line below, the Asia's interregional trade share declined a little bit in 2020. So largely, Asia's increasing interregional trade share is stemming from the quite close trade linkages with the PRC. So overall, from the overall picture, as you can see from these two, the yellow line and then the dotted orange line and the dotted orange line, the overall the trend is the upward. But when we exclude China, still the interregional trade share is stagnating at around 40%. So China factor is pretty much important for us to consider in looking at the Asia's interregional trade stories. Moving on to the right-hand side chart, as you can see, again, over the past 3 decades, Asia's excluding PRC trade share with China has almost more than the quadrupled over the past 3 decades, from 5.8% back in 1990 and rising to 26.5% by the 2020, while the Asia trade share with the EU has been declining from 17% to 10.7% over the same period. And also the more dramatic decline we can see from the Asia trade share with North America, so which have been almost halved over the 3 period from 25% to less than 13%. So now let me move on to the main stories of GBC and RBC landscape in Asia. So when we analyze the gross exports of Asia and also world, we used the decomposition methodology, which was adopted by the Wang Wei Zhu in the seminal 2014 AR paper. And then we used, ADB has developed our own, the multi-regional input-output data table, which covers the 63 countries around the world and also the 35 sectors included there. And using the unique multi-regional input-output data table, we tried to estimate the global GBC participation rate for the world and Asia's GBC participation rate, as well as Asia's RBC participation rate, to look at the overall trend of the Asia's value chain participation trend. So this analytical framework depicts how we analyze the gross export data to decompose those into the different components, starting from T1 to T6. T1 is, as you may know, the domestic value added fin, so which means when the certain product is exported to another country and consumed there, this doesn't involve any the production stage segmentation. So this does not belong to the picture of the value chain, GBC or either GBC or RBC. When it comes to the left-hand side, the Western hemisphere in this diagram, these are the capturing the portion of the GBC or the RBC exports. Some exports could be taking place between the Asian countries, which is being captured by area of A, and some portion could be taking place between Asian countries and the rest of the world, which is being captured by C, the part, and the D corresponds to the trade between the the rest of the world and the rest of the world, not involving any Asian countries. So based on this diagram, in calculating the world's GBC participation rate, the denominator should be all the aggregation of these components from A to F, and the numerator should be A plus C plus D. Then this gives us a number for the world's GBC participation rate. When it comes to the Asia's GBC participant rate, then the denominator should be A plus B plus C plus F. All the trade where Asia is being involved, whether it being related to the GBC or the non-GBC, then that should be the denominator as a gross export. And as a numerator, we select A plus C, the GBC related exports where Asian countries is being part of. So likewise, we can also calculate Asia's RBC, regional value chain participation rate, both net and gross, depending upon whether we sort out some channels going through the third economies or not. So based on this analytical framework, we estimate every year Asia's world's GBC participation rate and Asia's GBC, and as well as the RBC participation rate, as you can see from this chart. Overall, although we are not showing the point estimate for the 2000, back in 2000, the world GBC participation rate was much lower than the level that we are seeing at the moment, and that it has grown quite rapidly over since the early 2000, and then coming into the 2009, 10, we can see some belief in around the year of 2009 in terms of the world GBC participant rate as represented by the blue line due to the impact of the global financial crisis. And then it has recovered a little bit, but more recently, the world GBC participation rate is slowing down, in particular since 2018. There could be some factors behind this phenomenon. Some people are saying that perhaps the global value chain expansion might have reached some saturation point, and the other factors such as technological development could also work towards the shortening the GBC expansion, because the key notion of the GBC participation and expansion has been the offshoring and outsourcing motivation from the multinationals, utilizing the cheap labor and the production costs in the developing countries. But due to the rapid growth of the technological development, labor costs may not be anymore the key, the most important part of the production function for many of the multinationals. So in that sense, there could be some incentives to rewind the expansion of the GBC due to the technological development. Also, there could be some factors such as some trade conflicts between the major trading partners in the world, which should have negatively affected the expansion of the GBC. But all in all, since 2018, we can see some moderately decline the GBC participation rate. Asia's GBC participation rate, which is represented by the red line, follows largely the trend of the worlds. So the blue line and the red line are moving along quite closely. And then when it comes to, on the other hand, the Asia's RBC participation rate, the regional value chain participation, has even picked up since 2018, as depicted by the orange and the green line for both gross and net RBC participation rate. So in that sense, although the Asia's global value chain participation has stagnated since 2018, but Asia's regional value chain has even strengthened over time more recently. So this is quite interesting observation that we can find. So this slightly declining Asia's GBC participation rate, along with its strengthening RBC participation rate, leads to the quite steep increase in terms of Asia's RBC GBC intensity ratio. So RVC GVC intensity ratio is calculated by taking ratio between RVC participation rate and the GVC participation rate, and this is to measure the force of the regional value chain participation relative to the regions, the global value chain participation. As you can see from this chart, Asia's RVC GVC intensity ratio picked up quite significantly since 2015, and then on the other hand, the intensity ratio for both North America and EU have declined over time. So now the gap between Asia and the EU and the North America is getting wider and wider in terms of the RVC and the GVC intensity ratio. Another interesting observation that we can draw from this analysis is that when we look at the components of the RVC and GVC, Asia's regional value chain participation rate seems to be largely being driven by the complex value chain linkages. So, by simple GVC, we mean that when some intermediate good is exported to another country, then manufactured into final good and consumed there, then it just crosses border once, right? Before it is being manufactured into the final good. That's so-called the simple GVC. By complex GVC, what we mean is before a certain good is manufactured into the final good, the intermediate good crosses border twice or more. So it involves more fragmentation of the production stages across the borders. So when we decompose this value chain picture into simple and the complex and also non-GVC, as you can see from the chart, the portion of the non-GVC as represented by the orange bar chart has been declining. And then the simple GVC, as represented by the gray bar chart, are also declining over time. But on the other hand, the portion of the complex GVC as captured by the yellow bars are increasing since 2018. So although this is not pointing to any accurate causality between the ever-increasing RVC participation rate for Asia and its main factors contributing to that phenomenon, but that this gives us some idea that Asia's RVC participation rate and deepening regional value chain linkages are more being driven by the complex GVC than the simple GVC. This is, in a sense, a good sign for the region in terms of the progress of the more sophistication of the regional value chain linkages in the region. And also at the sector level, although the Asia's regional value chain linkages are more relying on the primary and the low-tech sectors, but when it comes to the growth rate, as you can see from this two chart on the right-hand side, high and medium tech and the business services, more recently, the growth rate of Asia's the RVC linkages have been jumping on this high-end sector. So in that sense, we can say that Asia's RVC is also getting more sophisticated, and regional value chain linkages are getting stronger, more driven by the high-end and medium tech sectors than the primary and low-tech sectors. Nevertheless, we can still see some quite significant heterogeneity across different countries in the region. Again, the RVC participation rate has risen over time from the 2000 to 2020, as you can see from the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, Asia's GVC participation rate has declined a little bit, slightly over time. But at the country level, some quite prominent heterogeneity we can observe. For example, Brunei Darussalam and Australia, as a major commodity and the raw material exporting countries, their participation for both the RVC and GVC are quite high and much higher than other countries such as the Pakistan, China, and Bangladesh, and also other the East Asia and the South Asian countries such as Korea and Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, which are mainly relying on the manufacturing sector as a main driver of their exports are more deeply um, embedded into the RBC and the GBC landscape. When it comes to complex and RBC and GBC stories, um, many of the ASEAN countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, Philippines are positioned at the higher um, spectrum of these two charts, which means that those ASEAN countries are more deeply embedded into the complex RBC and GBC landscape in the region compared to the other East Asian countries and South Asian countries. Um, Using ADB's multi-regional input-output data table, we can also look at some sectoral stories and pictures. Here we are picking up the electrical and optical equipment sector. For the backward linkages and the forward linkages. Backward linkages means that here our main focus is how trade between China and US can be affected from the different value chain linkages vis-a-vis other countries. Here, the thick, dark line from PRC to USA indicates that China's foreign value-added export to US. So which means that some part of the gross export of the electrical and optical equipment from China to USA could have been originally sourced from other countries, which are providing some intermediate good to PRC. So those countries could be Korea, Japan, and Taipei, China, and the rest of the world. And also, for example, there are some light green lines which are linking different countries and different regions. For example, ROW, the rest of the world could have provided some intermediate good export to Korea. Then the Korea could have manufactured those intermediate goods into another level of the product. Then we export it to China, and the China could have manufactured those into another layer of the export good, and which could have been re-exported to US. So there could be two stages, or the three steps, or the four step, even more different production steps fragmented across the borders. So here, for example, if US impose some tariff barriers, trade barriers against China on the electrical and optical equipment, then it could have some ripple impact over to other countries like the Korea, Japan, and Taipei, China, in this case, which were providing some intermediate good supply to China. So when the PRC's export to USA is blocked, or negatively hit due to the trade barriers, then there could be a spillover impact, negative spillover impact to the Korea, Japan, and Taipei, China's intermediate export to PRC. On the forward linkage side, China's intermediate good of the electrical and optical equipment exported to USA have been manufactured and then into another layer of the intermediate good, and we exported to Latin America, mainly to Canada and EU. And then some portion of the intermediate imported from PRC into USA could have been also manufactured into final good, another layer of the intermediate good, and re-exported to Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries as well. So if we look at another sector, such as the textile and textile products, for the backward linkages, China's the textile and textile products export to USA could have been largely sources from South Asian countries, including the India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, those countries, and some other portion could have been sourced from the Korea, Japan, East Asian countries, as well as some ASEAN countries. So here, the red line coming from the USA into PRC means some portion of the foreign value-added exports by the China to US could have been originally produced by USA itself. So for example, some textile and textile product exported to US by China could have been originally produced by US. China's role was adding some value to those imported portion from USA, and then the re-exporting those textile and textile products to the US. So value chain linkages are kind of intertwined between different countries around the globe. And on the forward linkage side, China's textile and textile products export to USA could have been manufactured into another layer of the intermediate goods and the final goods, and re-exported mostly to Latin America, EU, and Canada. And also some portion could have gone to the East Asian countries like the Korea, Japan, and the Hong Kong, China. So this kind of analytical decomposition can provide us some idea on when there could be some trade conflict between the two countries or more on a specific sector or specific product. What could be the repercussion caused to other countries, potential repercussion impact to be caused to other countries. So this can provide some good sense of how the ripple impacts will be taking place along the change of the global value chain linkages. So this table shows how different countries' role has evolved over time over the past 2 decades. So this is not simply based on how much each country accounts for, how much each country's GBC exports accounts for out of the global GBC export. This is based on quite the rigorous and the tedious codification and the running exercise. So, for example, for the PRC's case, in the case of PRC, China's contribution to world GBC remained at the mere 4.7% back in 2000, and then it increased quite significantly, reaching 16.6% by 2020. So this is based on the assumption, some hypothetical assumption. What if the world GBC participation rate could have been if the country did not exist in the world? So, and then based on that counterfactual, we can calculate the difference between the case where the country exists and the case where the country doesn't exist. And this difference gives us the specific country's contribution to the world GBC. So based on this exercise, as you can see from this table, US contribution to world GBC declined modestly from 21% to 15.6% over the past 2 decades. And then the EU's contribution has been staying at around the same level as the 35%. And the Japan's contribution has been almost halved over the past 2 decades, from 10% to 5.6%. And the Korea's contribution has increased a little bit from 4.6% to 5.3% over the past two decades. When it comes to the contribution to the world complex GBC, before I briefly discuss about the distinction between the simple GBC and the complex GBC, depending upon whether the fragmentation of production stages involve 2 countries only or the more than 2 countries, right? Then again, China's contribution to complex world GBC has increased quite a lot, from 4.9% to the 14.7% from 2000 to 2020. And like in the case of the overall contribution to world GBC, US contribution has declined over time from 21% to 14% for the past 2 decades. EU's contribution has increased a little bit from 41% to around 46%. So although EU's contribution to world overall GBC has been staying almost at the same level for the past decades, but its contribution to complex GBC, more complex GBC, has increased quite a bit. And when we compare to Japan and Korea, Japan's contribution to complex GBC has declined from 10% to 5%, while Korea's contribution has increased marginally from 5.7% to 6%. So as a topical issue, let me just check how I am doing in terms of time management? Okay, so impact of
15 minutes, don't worry. Yeah.
Okay. Impact of reshoring as some interesting topical issue because the post-pandemic there are a lot of discussion what's gonna be the future landscape of GBC. There are some argument that many countries will be pushing for more reshoring or some diversification or nearshoring, onshoring. So different scenarios can be conceived, but here we are analyzing the potential impact of reshoring of global supply chains. Perhaps I can skip this chart in the interest of time, but basically we are introducing our simulation scenarios into both backward and the forward based on the decomposition exercise again, the FVA, volume evaluated in the backward side and the return evaluated on the forward side. Then based on some assumptions and scenarios here, for example, when we assume overall the 10% of global supply chains are reshored, and then another scenario is 20% reshoring scenario, and another one is 40% reshoring scenario overall. At the same time, we need to introduce another dimension of the assumptions because not all the reshoring countries can replace reshored production capacity entirely with domestic production capacity because there could be some resource constraint and efficiency losses, right? For example, before the pandemic, the US, the unemployment rate was almost at the full employment level, with the employment rate at around 3.4 or 5%. So if that is the case, when US businesses reshore much of their production facilities from abroad, then it's going to be quite challenging for them to look for some laborers and workers under the full employment situation. So there could be some the frictional impacts and also some efficiency losses due to the reshoring. So we are introducing some scenarios, the 100% substitution rate, and then only half of the reshored production capacity could be replaced with the domestic production capacity, and even worst case scenario, 30% could be substituted. So based on these 3x3 scenarios, as you can see from this table, when the global supply chain is overall 10% to 20% reshored, the impact to the global exports will be negative 13 to 22%. So when the 10 to 20% of global supply chains are reshored, then the international export will be hit by 13 to 20% in a negative territory. Even if we assume the 100% substitution rate, under some hypothetical scenario where the reshoring countries can replace reshored production capacity with the domestic resources fully, but even in that case, as you can see from this table, 9 to 15% of the global exports will be hit from this supply chain reshoring scenarios because although the reshored production capacity can be replaced by domestic production capacity, but the original value chain linkages with other countries, third and the fourth countries, will be hit hard at the same time. So that's why the global trade will be negatively affected from these reshoring scenarios, even if there is 100% full substitution capacity is available in the reshoring countries. Overall, based on these two scenarios, 10% reshoring, the 20% reshoring, the baseline scenarios is based on the historical trend of the world trade in goods and services values. Based on the historical average of the growth rate, baseline scenarios depicts up to year 2025, the global trade will show some the increasing trend. But when we introduce 10% reshoring scenario, the global trade growth will be significantly moderated. And even when the 20% reshoring scenario, for the next 5 years, the global trade growth will suffer from even negative growth. So there could be quite significant repercussions when the reshoring motivation being pursued by many of the countries are materialized. So different impacts across different regions we are showing. Across different reshoring scenarios, such as 10%, 20%, 40%, the EU turns out to be hit the most from the reshoring scenario, followed by Latin America and then Asia. Within Asia, Central Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries are estimated to be the hit harder compared to other sub-regions, because many of the Central Asian countries are the commodity and the raw material exporting countries. So when the reshoring scenario materializes, their linkage into the global value chain will be hit hard, because their commodity export will not be demanded by many of the countries in the world. So lastly, let me touch upon another topical issue, which is the challenges with respect to the semiconductor supply chains. As you know, the semiconductor is essential component used for the mobile phones, the automobiles, and the communication gadget, and even military equipments. So it is an essential part of our daily lives. And then actually, the Goldman Sachs has identified 169 industries which use at least 1% of their value addition to utilize semiconductor products. So then based on the Goldman Sachs, the 169 industrial identification, we dovetail those with the UN Comtrade data. So based on this exercise, according to our estimation, around 76% the global exports are related to semiconductors in one way or another. And as you can see from this chart, the blue block indicates semiconductor chips exports themselves, and the dark blue block captures the products with chips inside, such as automobile, laptop computer, and then the refrigerator, even many other household the appliances. And then the light green block indicates the products which are not using chips and also are not containing chips inside, but its production relies on the chips. For example, the production of the steel and the ready-made concrete and the soap manufacturing, although those are not containing chips inside, but the manufacturing of those goods requires machineries which should contain chips inside. So based on this, the classification, as I mentioned, around the 76% of the global exports are relying on the semiconductor chips, directly or indirectly. And then that is more pronounced for Asia. More than 80% of the Asia's total exports are involving semiconductors in one way or another. And that reliance has even grown over time from 2010 to 2020. And then this is followed by EU and North America and Latin America in that order. And within Asian regions, apparently East Asia, like the Japan, Korea, and China, are relying heavily on the semiconductors as its main component drivers of their exports. And this is followed by Southeast Asian countries, many of the ASEAN countries, and then the South Asian countries. When it comes to the import share are largely evenly divided across different regions. And then for the Asian subregions, the East Asia and the Southeast Asia are the main importer of semiconductor chips themselves. In 2020, actually, both semiconductor devices as well as the the electronic integrated circuit, IC, exports increased. The HS code 8541 and the 8542 both increased by 90% and 19% respectively. Then you might wonder why we are seeing the chip shortages, although the total exports of both semiconductors and electronic IC have increased in the past year. So one hypothetical, anecdotal story is that when the older people, almost all the people hunkered down due to the pandemic, many of the semiconductor producers switched their focus more toward computers and laptops, and then some medical appliances such as artificial respiration during the pandemic, and also under the prevalence of the work from home arrangement environment. But over time, when the economy started to reopen, which have driven the recovery of the demand for example, motor vehicles, automobiles, other transportation vehicles, those semiconductor producers could not meet the increasing demand from the automobiles because still the elevated level of the demand for the work from home appliances have not abated. So this explains partly what's the source of the semiconductor chip shortages around the world, potentially mismatches between the supply and demand. Sectoral mismatches between the supply and demand could be one compelling story there. So as you can see from this chart, last year the motor vehicles and automobiles lost their exports quite significantly, while the exports of the computer and laptops and other work from home appliances export increased quite significantly.
So sorry, you have 5 minutes now.
Okay, sure. Global semiconductor appliances market are accounted for by firstly the mobile phones and the ICT infrastructure and computers, and the automobile actually account for around 10% of consumption of the semiconductors. One unique feature of the semiconductor sector is its high degree of specialization and its geographical concentration. For example, the foundry market, which are being utilized by many of the US and EU companies to outsource their production capacity to East Asian countries. The more than 70% of the global foundry market is accounted for by two companies, TSMC of China and the Samsung of Korea. So this indicates how much the semiconductor sector could be vulnerable to potential supply chain disruption, even one segment or one geographical location of the production facilities. This is the vertical specialization. Let me skip this and in interest of time. So this chart describes the semiconductor value chains into 8 stages, and then the first 5 stages above indicates the R&D intensive segment of the semiconductor value chains. For example, the EDA, electronic design, the automation, and the core IP logic, DAO, discrete analog and optoelectronics. Those segments, high-end, upper segment of the global semiconductor supply chains are being covered mainly by US. So US is mainly specialized in high-end segment of high-end stream of the value chain for the semiconductor production, such as design and the discrete analog and optoelectronics. When it comes to the memory, as you can see from this, the blue sky block, the 59% of global memory market is accounted for by 2 Korean companies like the Samsung and the SK Hynix. And the manufacturing equipment are again accounted for by US and the Japanese companies. And in the middle stream of the value chain, the capex intensive sectors, materials and wafer fabrication are largely evenly divided across different countries. And then actually the lower end of the spectrum, which is the capex and labor intensive segment of the value chain, which is mainly focused on the assembly, packaging, and testing procedures of semiconductors, are largely covered by China. So in that sense, China is more specialized into the lower end of the the value chain spectrum of the semiconductor production. So overall, as you can see from the overall value chain segment, the 38% of the semiconductor global value chain is accounted for by US, and then the Korea 16%, the 14% by China, and the, Japan, and only 9% is being explained by China, because the China is mainly specialized in the low-end segment of the value chain. And then when it comes to the consumption, almost half, 49% of the global semiconductor consumption is being driven by US and China. So US and China are the main importer of semiconductor products. To wrap my presentation up, so again, then Asia's trade growth has been quite resilient during the pandemic, and this is partly driven by the China's quite quick recovery in terms of their trade growth after having been relatively successful in containing the pandemic outbreak within the region. The interregional trade linkages are getting stronger in Asia. Also, this has some implication when it comes to the Chinese role, because many of the Asian countries have close trade linkages with the PRC. And then the sectoral supply-demand mismatch and the geographical concentration and extreme specialization could exacerbate the semiconductor shortage problem. So in our actually report on the economic integration, we are coming up with some kind of policy recommendations, such as supply chain diversification and more investment having to be made in the R&D and CapEx for the semiconductor sector. According to our estimation, around the $3 trillion of the further investment should be made to double the semiconductor production capacity by year 2030. Asia's value chain linkage with the world has shrank over time. More recently, that its regional value chain linkages, on the other hand, have got even more stronger during the pandemic and in more recent years. And then also, as I have shown before, Asia's regional value chain participation is gearing more toward the more sophisticated segment of the value chain, and also the high and medium, the technology products, and then the business services, which is a good sign in terms of the progress in the sophistication of the regional value chain for the region overall. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.